A cocky tourist, obsessed with medieval traditions and historical reenactments, decides to challenge a royal guard to a duel in front of Buckingham Palace. Armed with nothing but a toy sword and boundless arrogance, he expects a funny, viral moment. But what he gets instead is a cold, calculated response that leaves him humiliated and reeling. Marcus had always considered himself a man of culture. Back home, he spent hours watching historical documentaries, reenacting medieval duels with his friends, and debating the art of combat in online forums. He wasn't just an ordinary tourist. He was a self-proclaimed modern-day knight, obsessed with the honor of single combat and the codes of chivalry. So when he arrived in London and saw the royal guard standing tall outside Buckingham Palace, a ridiculous idea formed in his mind. I should challenge one of them to a duel. At first, it was just a joke between him and his two friends who were filming his trip for his social media channel. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. People online were always saying the royal guards were trained soldiers, but how much of that was real? He had seen dozens of prank videos where tourists screamed in their faces, danced in front of them, or tried to make them flinch. The guards never reacted. They weren't real warriors. Marcus was convinced they were just actors in funny costumes, meant to entertain the tourists and stand still like statues. But what if he could make history? What if he was the first tourist to challenge a royal guard to a duel and get an actual response? That would be viral gold. Marcus wasn't stupid. He knew that attacking a guard would get him arrested. So he had a workaround. Instead of a real weapon, he had a foam sword, a cheap souvenir he had bought from a gift shop. To him, this wasn't just a piece of plastic, it was a symbol of chivalry. He would issue his challenge like a true knight, standing before the royal guard, demanding honor on the battlefield. Surely the crowd would love it. Surely the royal guard would at least react, even if just with a smirk or a shake of the head. That was all he needed. One tiny reaction, and he would prove his theory right. Buckingham Palace was packed. Tourists lined up at the gates, snapping photos, marveling at the grandeur of the Queen's official residence. The golden gates shimmered in the sunlight, and the red uniformed guards stood like statues, their rifles held at perfect angles, their famous bearskin hats towering over the crowd. Marcus's adrenaline surged. This was his moment. His friends were in position, one filming from the left, another standing near the crowd to capture the audience reaction. He straightened his shirt, gripped his foam sword, and stepped forward, pushing past the tourists. People turned to look at him, eyes widening as they noticed the ridiculous weapon in his hand. Some chuckled, others whispered. Phones went up. Marcus grinned. The crowd was paying attention. He cleared his throat, puffed out his chest, and took a dramatic stance in front of the nearest royal guard, who remained as still as a statue. "Sir Knight of the British Crown," Marcus bellowed, his voice loud and theatrical. The murmuring crowd grew silent. "I, Sir Marcus of the Freelands, hereby challenge you to honorable combat." The royal guard didn't blink. The tension in the air shifted. The crowd, sensing something unusual was happening, grew larger. Tourists whispered, snickered, and raised their cameras, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus smiled. This was exactly what he wanted. It was time to see if the legends were true. And so, gripping his foam sword, he pointed it at the chest of the royal guard. And waited. Would he react? Would he speak? Would he laugh? Marcus had no idea. But in just a few moments, he would regret everything. Because the royal guard was about to show him exactly why he was feared. The foam sword hung in the air, its cheap plastic tip barely inches from the royal guard's chest. Marcus stood firm, his stance wide, his chin lifted in mock confidence, playing the part of a noble warrior issuing his challenge. The crowd grew silent, the murmurs dying down as more tourists stopped to watch. Some chuckled, others simply stared, waiting to see what would happen next. Cameras and phones were everywhere, capturing every second. Marcus thrived on the attention. This was exactly what he wanted. And yet, the guard didn't move. Not a single flinch, not even a twitch of an eyebrow. Absolute stillness. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. He had expected something, a smirk, a scoff, maybe even a muttered insult. But there was nothing. The royal guard stood like a carved statue, his eyes locked straight ahead, his posture unbreakable, the rifle in his grip as steady as a stone pillar. Marcus cleared his throat and tried again. "Do you not hear me, noble warrior? I have challenged thee." Nothing. Laughter bubbled through the crowd, but not for the reason Marcus had hoped. They weren't laughing with him, they were laughing at him. Someone in the back shouted, "Bro, he doesn't care!" Another voice. "That's the most British ignore I've ever seen." Marcus's face twitched. No, he wasn't about to let his moment slip away like this. He swiped his foam sword in the air, making a dramatic arc, the toy weapon whistling uselessly through nothing. Still, no reaction. Marcus forced a grin, turning to the crowd. "I suppose I must strike first to earn his honor in battle." The moment those words left his mouth, Marcus made the biggest mistake of his life. With a quick, exaggerated motion, he tapped the foam sword against the guard's shoulder. It was meant to be playful. It was meant to be harmless. It was meant to get a reaction. He got one. The sound of a boot slamming against pavement cracked through the air like a gunshot. Thump! The royal guard moved. And not just a little. It was a deliberate, trained, explosive motion, precise and controlled, filled with the weight of centuries of discipline. The rifle snapped into a defensive stance, the bayonet gleaming in the afternoon light. Marcus barely had time to breathe before the guard took one powerful step forward, his boot striking the pavement with the force of a war drum. The crowd gasped. Phones shook as cameras zoomed in. The laughter stopped instantly. Marcus felt all the blood drain from his face. This was real. His arms locked, his body frozen, as he stared into the eyes of the royal guard, a man who had gone from unmoving statue to a fully engaged soldier in less than a second. Marcus had been expecting a performer. He had found a warrior. His heart slammed against his ribs, his legs screaming at him to move, to step back, to run. But he couldn't. He had pushed too far. And now he was about to learn exactly why you don't mess with a royal guard. Marcus couldn't move. The moment his foam sword had tapped the royal guard's shoulder, his entire reality shifted. Gone was the silent, unshakable figure standing watch outside Buckingham Palace. What stood before him now was a soldier in motion, a man who had spent years training for discipline, for action, for moments just like this. Thump. The second step came harder, the guard closing the distance between them with terrifying efficiency. His rifle, once a harmless ornament to Marcus's eyes, was now a deadly extension of his body, gripped in an unbreakable stance. The bayonet gleamed. Marcus's breath hitched, his legs locked up, his heart pounded like a war drum. The crowd? Dead silent. Every tourist, every camera, every person who had been laughing just moments ago was now frozen in place, watching the scene unfold like a train wreck they couldn't look away from. Marcus's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't a funny, viral moment. This was a soldier reacting to a threat, and Marcus was that threat. For the first time since Marcus had started his ridiculous challenge, the guard spoke. "Stand back!" The words were like a cannon blast, booming, deep, filled with absolute authority. Marcus flinched, the sheer force of the command hitting him like a physical blow. The tourists around him gasped, some stumbling backward themselves, as if the command had been directed at all of them at once. Marcus had watched countless videos of the guards ignoring harassment, standing motionless no matter what was thrown at them. He had never seen them like this. His hands trembled. His fake foam sword suddenly felt like an insult to everything this man represented. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt completely out of his depth. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some reenactment or street performance. This was the real deal. And Marcus had just crossed a line he never should have touched. The guard took one more step forward, his stance now fully engaged. Marcus staggered back instinctively, almost tripping over his own feet. For the first time, the tourists watching weren't laughing at him anymore. They were watching a fool realize his mistake in real time. The energy in the air wasn't amusement. It was secondhand fear. Phones were still recording, but the expressions behind them had changed. No one was cheering him on anymore. No one was laughing along with his prank. They were watching a man who had just made the worst decision of his life. Marcus wanted to speak, to crack a joke, to make it seem like he was still in control. But his voice betrayed him. No words came out, because deep down he knew. He had no control anymore, and the royal guard, he was just waiting for Marcus to make another mistake. Marcus's entire body locked up. The royal guard's stance had shifted completely, transforming from an unmoving statue into a force of absolute control. His rifle, once held with ceremonial ease, was now positioned with deadly precision, the polished bayonet gleaming under the London sun. Marcus had thought the guards were props for tourist amusement. But now, staring into the cold, unwavering discipline of the man before him, he understood his mistake too late. The words, "Stand back," were still ringing in his ears, a warning that should have been enough, but his own body betrayed him. Instead of immediately backing away, Marcus hesitated, just for half a second, and that was all the guard needed. Thump. The guard's boot slammed against the pavement again, another step forward, and before Marcus could react, the rifle moved. Fast, precise, terrifying. The butt of the rifle snapped upward, striking Marcus's foam sword so hard that it was ripped from his hands, flying into the air and landing several feet away. The tourists watching gasped collectively. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Marcus stumbled back, his hands instinctively raising in surrender, his face drained of color. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was supposed to be a joke, a harmless prank. But the royal guard didn't see a joke. He saw a threat. And he had responded with the kind of calculated, controlled force that Marcus never could have imagined. Marcus's legs failed him, the shock of the moment overwhelming his senses. As he tripped over his own feet, his body tilted backward, and for a brief, humiliating moment, he collapsed onto the pavement. The hard gravel scraped against his hands, his breath hitching as the sheer weight of his failure crashed down on him. Phones were still filming. Hundreds of tourists were staring. And the worst part? The royal guard had already reset. The moment Marcus hit the ground, the soldier had returned to his post, as if nothing had happened at all. As if Marcus had never existed. The rifle was back in position. His stance was once again rigid, perfect, unshaken. And that's what broke Marcus the most. He had come here thinking he could force a reaction, thinking he could rattle the legendary composure of the royal guard. And yet, he was the only one who had lost control. Laughter. At first, it was just a few chuckles. Then, as Marcus struggled to sit up, brushing the dust off his palms, the crowd erupted into full-blown laughter. People were pointing, some outright howling, others shaking their heads at his stupidity. The footage was already being uploaded, cameras zooming in on his humiliated expression, the fallen foam sword, the unshaken soldier behind him. A tourist muttered, "That's got to be the dumbest thing I've seen this year." Another added, "Dude, just challenged a royal guard and got wrecked by his own feet." Marcus could feel his face burning. He scrambled up, his legs still shaking, his chest tight with humiliation. This wasn't a nightly duel. This wasn't a historic moment. This was a disaster. And worst of all, the Royal Guard had already moved on. Marcus was nothing to him, nothing but another fool who had tested the limits and failed. Marcus could still hear the roar of laughter echoing in his ears as he stumbled to his feet, his body trembling, not from pain, but from sheer, crushing humiliation. He had come here thinking he would make history, force a reaction from one of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. Instead, he was now the main character of a public disaster. Phones were still pointed at him. People were laughing, whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. And the worst part? The Royal Guard hadn't moved. The man who had just humiliated him in seconds stood there unshaken, unreadable, indifferent, as if Marcus had never existed. Marcus desperately wanted to play it off. He forced a fake chuckle, trying to act like he was in on the joke. "Ha ha! Okay. You win, man!" No one laughed with him. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. Someone called out, "You deserve that, mate." Another voice, "You thought that was gonna end well?" Marcus's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a failed prank. This was a complete public meltdown, and the internet was about to have a field day. Marcus spotted his friends, his camera crew, still holding their phones, still recording. But they weren't cheering him on. They weren't grinning like they usually did after one of his stunts. They looked embarrassed. One of them, Steve, shook his head. "Dude, let's go." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, to save face, to salvage something from this wreck. But then, a new sound filled the air. Heavy boots, moving toward him. Marcus turned his head just in time to see two Metropolitan Police officers pushing their way through the crowd. His breath hitched. This wasn't part of the plan. The officers didn't waste time. "Sir," one of them said, his voice firm, "step aside. We need to have a word." Marcus's chest tightened. "Hey man, it was just a joke," he blurted out, raising his hands. It's a foam sword, for God's sake." The officer didn't blink. Impersonating a challenge to military personnel is no joke. Marcus's mouth went dry. Oh, this was bad. People in the crowd were still filming, but now their expressions had shifted. This wasn't just funny anymore. This was serious. The officers stepped closer, and Marcus felt his legs go weak again. In one day, he had gone from mocking a royal guard to being publicly humiliated. And now he was about to be arrested. As the officers led him away, Marcus did something he hadn't planned to do. He looked back. His gaze drifted to the royal guard, still standing in place, rifle at his side, his posture rigid and disciplined. The man who had ruined his ego in a matter of seconds. The man who had never even acknowledged his existence. And Marcus hated how much that stung, because he wanted a reaction, a smirk, a glare, something. But he got nothing. To the royal guard, Marcus was just another tourist who had tested the limits and lost. And as he was dragged away, cameras still rolling, his video still going viral for all the wrong reasons, Marcus realized something that made his stomach turn. The royal guard would forget this moment in minutes. But he would remember it for the rest of his life.